This is a recording of Ann Tabor talking about the history of Alpena from February 26, 1978.
I came across a group of graves that puzzled me. Everybody there died. It was all one family. They all died in 1872. And, well, the mother and the father didn't. But there were five children's graves, little bitty graves, where all these kids had died in 1872, and yet not all at the same time. They died within months of each other, and they were from practically newborn up to maybe 6, 7, 8 years old, all very close together. Now, if they died all on the same day, that I could understand. I would look for a fire or something like that, but they had died over the year, and then in a couple of years the mother died, and in a few more years the father died very young, very, very quickly. And I wondered about it. Well, we have the advantage of the old newspapers, so I knew the dates of the deaths, and so I went down. No, I didn't go down, I went home. I had the old newspapers at home then. And went home and looked them up, 1872, what had happened. And it was the smallpox epidemic, and it was the first I'd heard of that. So it led me to the story of smallpox in Alpena and what it did to us. That terrible year of 1872, we were less than 5,000 people. There were, I think, 500 cases of smallpox in town, 50 deaths, which is, makes quite a mark in a town this size. Then I followed it up and found there were more smallpox incidents, which didn't necessarily hit Alpena. Alcona County suffered dreadfully one year, all of which led me to a whole chapter, shall we say, of smallpox and the like, and the story of early doctors in this town. Yet another chapter that one can do to add to a book of people in Alpena, his story, the most important thing about history of a small town, the people. As I started out with this series, what seems like forever ago, let's see, that was the weekend of the big blizzard of 78, you all will remember, and some of you hardy souls were here. History keeps being revised. I got revised last week a couple times. By Bob Scott, for one thing, who came up and said afterwards that he believed that we were wrong in saying that Powers was the first, as we had said, Bob and I and Mr. Oliver, I won't take full credit for this mistake, was the first fire chief of the volunteer fire department of 1871 that they hastily organized after they bought Saganto, the little fire engine, and after the town had already burned down considerably on the north side, they decided it was time to have a fire department. I had read in Oliver, and I'd always been led to believe that Powers was the first fire chief. Not so. Mr. Scott couldn't have been more right. He sent me this during the week, for which I thank him. He said that Margaret's grandfather, Dr. James McTavish, was the chief, and here's the living proof of that. Dr. James McTavish, who lived on Fletcher Street, just about across where the back of the post office is now, was the first fire chief of the original fire company number 1 of Alpena, Michigan, organized May 1871, right after the April fire that destroyed the north side. And on it are listed in alphabetical order all of the people that were in it. In looking up Oliver again to make sure I was right the first time, because I've been wrong many, many times, I discovered that maybe Mr. Oliver didn't like Dr. McTavish or something. He doesn't even put Dr. McTavish's name in the original list. So there you are. Another case in point, as I'm always telling my kids in school, don't believe everything you read. Just because you read it doesn't make it so. So I stand corrected, and we've added another facet, another thing to Alpena history. Came by something I make my kids, I try to, it doesn't always work. I make my kids in school do what we call, like big folks, a research project. They all groan and carry on, but most of them end up giving me something before the semester is over. They'd better. It's half their grade. And although I'm a chicken grader, if they'll just sit there and listen for a semester, that's enough, Lord knows, And some of it's bound to soak in, I figure. And with that great information that I give them, and 50 cents, they can buy a cup of coffee in the future. It's about that important, really, but interesting, I think. Maybe it'll turn a few of them onto history altogether. Poor dears, they have to take a lot of it. They might as well learn to like it right off. And history at a local level is a lot more likable than President Jackson in the kitchen cabinet and some of that other stuff that's so remote from these children today, History they can go out and walk on. and look at, and history that might involve their great-grandfathers in one respect or another, is certainly a lot more interesting. So if they can get into history that way and get so they, automatically we raise our fists against when somebody says history. It's a not fun thing to take in school, and I would like to make it a fun thing. And local history, I think, can be fun. So they have to do projects for me, and in which I hope to glean their brains, you see. A lot of them come from old families, and I get more good information that way. For instance, this week, a little gal brought in to me a Xerox copy of a letter that just knocked me out. The letter was dated January 26, 1968, to Mrs. Belle Fitzpatrick of the Globe Hotel. Many of you know Belle. Sam Portwine, who was involved with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters Detroit office in 1968, wrote to Belle. I was reading a book on the life of Henry Ford during his formative years, and I'm enclosing a letter that he wrote, a copy of it. It was a Xerox copy of Henry's original letter that he wrote to his wife from the Globe Hotel in Alpena. Isn't that exciting? And here, every time I come across new information, I usually make a ditto of it. Haven't gotten around to running this one off, so that I can have several copies for people who are interested, and for my kids who are doing research, and for myself, because I always lose everything. I got to have a dozen copies of everything to keep track of it all. And no kidding, Henry wrote on the old letterhead of the Globe Hotel, Dougal McDonald, proprietor, corner of 2nd and Washington Avenue. By golly, it's still there. Alpena, Michigan, March 3rd, 1891. And the misspelling, it's so comforting to know that a genius like Henry Ford couldn't spell. It made me feel so good. He didn't do anything with punctuation. He just ran on. All of his I's were small I's. Isn't that a comfort? There is hope for all of us. My own dear, and then circled, he wrote first. Could he have known what was to happen? All of the stuff that we're getting now about what happened to Henry later, this new book that's out, right? Well, anyway, my own dear first little wife, this was 1891. Henry was still being very faithful. I left Detroit about 10 o'clock for Osable, but changed my mind, M-I-N-D-E, on the boat, came to Alpena. It took 27 hours. We got to Lexington about dark, and I was afraid of taking cold, so I got a room and went to bed. We had horses, cattle, and chickens on board, B-O-R-D. The first thing I knew after I went to bed was to hear the red crossed out roosters crowing, C-R-O-I-N-G, and then heard someone ask another if we were, W-A-R-E, in someone's farmyard. But we were in the middle of Saginaw Bay. Saginaw Bay was rough, R-U-F-F, but no one was seasick. I like Alpena, everybody friendly. There, T-H-E-I-R, all the way through, was a turnout last night, 2 miles long. There is music here night and day. I haven't been around much, M-U-T-C-H, yet, but have a good idea of the town. There is 14,000 people here. 1891, I think he exaggerates a little. But I wish you were here. I bet I will never go so far from you again. Look for me anytime after Tuesday. Goodbye, darling. Yours, Y-O-R-S, Henry. Isn't that wonderful? Honest. I wonder what was going on. Now, I got to get down to the newspapers downtown in the library where the microfilm is of all the newspapers. March 3rd, 1891. The paper for the closest to that date, because they were weekly papers, I will be able to find out what they were doing. 2-mile-long turnout, music night and day. What was happening in town? I don't know, but I bet it leads to another story, and a good one. Of course, Henry hadn't invented the Model T yet, had he? 1891. Wonder what he was up to. Well, we'll just have to find out. And that's how history is detected. It's fun. It really is fun. And it put me in mind of the hotels. Got to keep my eye on that clock. I get carried away. Put me in mind of the hotels, the early hotels. And another chapter that could be written about a people of early Alpena, Jules Potvin. There are Potvins all over the place now, mostly all relatives, I expect, of Jules and his brother, Julius, I guess his name really was, but they called him Jules. Black River, notably, has Potvins in it. Willard, the Alpena Savings Bank. Julius came here. He was born in Canada in 1833. His brothers came to Alpena from their Canadian home and found work, as so many people did in that early era of Alpena, when lumber, there was more work than there were men to do it. You could always find a job. Not a lot of money, perhaps, but make a living, for sure. The territory here was booming. Promise of it becoming very big. Certainly a lot of work to be done. So he wrote home, the first brother that came wrote home for his younger brother, Julius, to come a-running. There was money to be made in Alpena. So in October 1862, Jules Putman did come to Alpena. 1862. He arrived on the good ship City of Cleveland, a young and eager man of 29 years, possessed of a powerful constitution, prodigious energy, and an empty purse, which is bound to motivate you right there. The mill that later became Mason and Company mill was just being erected when Julius arrived, and he stepped up. He had never learned the millwright's trade, that is the putting together of a mill, but he stepped up and applied for the job and got it. He learned very quickly. Perhaps his bosses never even realized that he was completely green at the job. He was steadily employed for about 6 weeks, and at the end of that time he made up his mind that Alpena was the place for him for the rest of his life, so he went back up to Canada to get the little woman. They came to Alpena that fall of 1862, the young couple. On a boat they had become acquainted with another person who was coming to Alpena, Mr. McKnight, who was bringing several teams of horses to work in the woods. Everything had to be imported. There was no road into town. 1862, the first road had not been built yet all the way. It ended Saginaw North, I believe. It would have ended at the Osable because they hadn't built the Singing Bridge yet. And from there on, it was just the great trail to the north, the old Indian trail to the copper country along the shore. Came through Harrisville, Alcona, Black River, hugged the shore pretty tightly all the way up, but it was hardly passable. In the summertime, it was up to the hubcaps in mud, and in the wintertime, it was more passable because of the frozen land. Most of the transportation, though, in that day, the going to and from, waited for the lake to break, and it was all done by boat until we got a railroad, really. And that wasn't until 1886. We were here 30 years before they ever got the railroad through all the way. At any rate, Mr. McKnight was coming to bring several teams of horses. That apparently was his business. I don't think he was coming to stay. They arranged that Jules stay. They had to leave the boat out a ways. They couldn't dock at the river yet. The dredging of the river wasn't accomplished until, I think, 1864. And before that time, big boats that drew a lot of water, couldn't come up the river and dock in town here. They had to stay out in the bay quite a ways in deep water, and then they would take lighters out to relieve them of their load, passengers, horses, whatever. Well, they were kind of worried about leaving the horses on the boat overnight, and it was too late to get a lighter to come out and get them. So Putman said he'd stay on the boat and look after the horses. And McKnight took Mrs. Putman into town, left him with a slice of bread and some cold meat for a midnight lunch, and he settled down on a bale of hay and spent that night 1.5 miles out in Lake Huron. Jules worked in the woods for several winters, a couple of winters, and then started to carry out a plan that had been rolling around in the back of his head for some time, ever since he'd hit Alpena. He let it be known that he was contemplating buying some property, buying a couple of lots in close to the downtown area. No sooner said than George Fletcher took him by the arm and led him to some very fine lots, which he, George, owned, as he did so much of the property here. They were very fine lots indeed, if you could find them. They were still covered by brush, woods, no real road laid to them, just a surveyor's line out what was to be Chisholm Street. But Jules Putman could look through the trees and the brush as they were and envision what he could make out of it. So he bought the lots, the same lots where the Alpena Hotel, shall we call it, gee, I can't keep track of all the changes, Kentucky Motor Inn, right, stands today. He bought those lots, 2 of them, for the tremendous sum of $25 for one and $50 for the corner lot. Boy, that's why they call it the good old days, huh? Can you imagine? For 2 winters he worked in the woods, gathered a little money together, and in 1865 built a small hotel on the center lot, the small lot, and he and his wife moved into it. It was known as the Alpena House, but it burned like everything else in Alpena. Burned at least once or twice, but Jules rebuilt it, this time on the corner, on the big lot on the corner. And there the hotel stood all through the years. I remember it well when I came to town. I don't know when exactly. I'd have to check with the Gagnes, although I probably have that information someplace. Not too good at dates. Don't consider them all that important, to tell you the truth. When I came to town here, when Fred and I came back after the war, that was World War II, my kids asked me, what war was that, Civil War? Not even World War I, kids. I hadn't quite made it by then. Almost, but not quite. 1945, I think, and the Alpena House was certainly there. The Alpena Hotel, right, the big white hotel that sat right tied up to the sidewalk with the Knott's Bar. That ought to ring a bell with some of you. Spent many a night there myself. The Alpena House became the favorite watering spot of Paulette Cicero, for instance. Also, it saw the likes of Blinky Morgan when he was in town holding up away from the law. Another chapter that we should certainly cover sometime. The capture of the infamous Blinky Morgan, public enemy number one, if there had been such a list in 1887. Yes, Blinky was known to stand up and have a shot and a beer at the Alpena House bar. I don't know whether it was, the Knott's Bar was down in the basement, wasn't it?
No.
Down, wasn't it?
Down the side street.
Yeah, well, I remember somehow I always felt like I was sneaking into a speakeasy.
Yeah.
When it was on the side, yeah, you're right. It looked like a basement when you got in. Maybe that's why I thought it was. Well, some of you will remember what happened to Jules Putnam's Alpena House. It reigned through all those years from about 1865 when it was rebuilt, straight through until, as I say, the late 1940s, at least, if not into the 1950s, looking the same. Later, at first, it had the front porch, but didn't have the balcony across. You will remember it had the veranda across the top. And Jules Putnam he got very fat, very prosperous looking, and probably prosperous too. And he used to sit up on the balcony overlooking Chisholm Street as the horses came and went. Up on top, like with all early hotels, there was a cupola where the little boy would sit to watch for incoming steamboats across the bay so that they could rush the hotel rig down to the dock to catch the passengers before they got in any other rig to another hotel. And then when the Gagnes bought, it changed hands several times, of course, Walter Keenan for years. When Gagnes bought it, Keenan's built in the 1930s or 30s, I think, they built a brick addition to the back. Then when Gagnes bought it and it became Gagne Motor Inn, they tore down the old white part of the hotel and left the back addition. Now the back addition is what you see in the parking lot in front of the Kentucky Motor Inn on Chisholm Street, is where the original hotel once sat. In the lobby, however, is a clock, a beautiful old clock that Jules apparently brought from Canada when he came, and with all the changes of ownership, it has been preserved through those many, many years. And it is one gorgeous clock. I'm sure many of you know the one that I mean when you partake of the cheese bar there in the lobby, you know. Another chapter. Well, it's back to school again. I'm kind of proud of this, really. This was another course I had to take. I got an A on it, right there, A. Isn't that great? A paper that I had to write for, I have to write papers too, for a college course that I took, a couple years ago, I guess. And one of the things we had to do was come up with the infamous term paper. So, like most everybody else, and certainly like my own kids in school, I waited till the night before, and then hauled out some stuff that I thought would do. And it did fine. It did real good. But it's about one of my favorite characters, and the notation on here, when I handed it in to the professor, was he thought it was just great, and that I should publish it. And he wanted to take it back to Mount Pleasant. Now, I'm not bragging, because he's out of his mind, because it was not a good paper. Not too bad, but I padded it like crazy with quotes from every place. You know, could have done much better if given a little time. Must sit down and do that, because it's about one of my favorite characters in this town, and a fellow that not too many folks know, perhaps. A fellow by the name of Professor F.S. Dewey. Franklin Smith Dewey, he was known. I have labeled him here Northwood Schoolmaster, and I guess that's as good as any. Professor Dewey was quite a guy. He was superintendent of schools here for several years, back in the early days of Michigan, of Alpena's school history. He trying to spot a couple things. Franklin Smith Dewey, known hereabouts as the professor. He wasn't a professor really, although he did have a master's degree, which is a little unusual. But that was a moniker given to just about anybody in those days. This was back in the 1870s, early 70s, who had any book learning at all, because in those days there were a powerful lot of people who couldn't read or write at all. He was superintendent of the Union School District No. 1 of Alpena, Michigan. He can't even claim the distinction of having been our first superintendent. That distinction fell to Charles Brockway, who held forth in real obscurity from 1869 to 1871. And then Franklin Smith Dewey arrived on the scene. However, I don't remember Dewey particularly because he was superintendent of schools, also principal, also swept out at night, I think, probably, and taught several classes, because everybody had to double up in those days. But because of what Dewey became, I mean, the kind of a guy that he was, not just your everyday school teacher, but a man endowed with a blessed curiosity that led him to discover a lot of things about our county and to leave us some of those things. He had been born to a mother and father who were natives of New England and true Michigan pioneers. They came here in 1829, not in Alpena, of course, wasn't any, but came to Michigan, southern Michigan, 1829. Cleared virgin pine, actually started a farm, had a whole bunch of kids, 9 I believe, sent most of them to college. Most of them went to Adrian. Dewey went on to the University of Michigan and then got his master's degree from the university 3 years after his bachelor's degree. Married quite early, went back to teach in the original country school and where he had been educated, moved up to become a principal in Saginaw, and then Alpena called him. He came and stayed at the Morel House, $12 for a few days. Then for $12 a month he managed to rent a house for he and his wife on the Bay Shore. But it was a drafty old house on what I assume State Street. And so it wasn't very long before he managed to build his own home. And some of you may remember the Dewey home. It was on the corner, I don't, it was gone when I got here, on the corner of 3rd and Maple Street. It was a vacant lot for many, many years there. Now there is a small house on it. I remember because I lived down the alley from it on 4th Street. And several reasons I remember it. I'm a mushroom freak. Can't get, coming from the prairies of South Dakota, I can't get over going out in the woods and picking things. I can't get over going out in the woods, period. We don't have that stuff back in South Dakota, woods and water and neat things like that. And I've never quite gotten over it, even in 30 years of living here. Still have to go out and ride through the woods every spring just to make sure they're still there. And then I got onto this Morel mushrooming bit, Never have had any luck at all, but I do enjoy the looking. Gives you a good chance to get out in the woods in the early spring, right? So I had been out looking for Morel mushrooms, came home with about 4. That's par for the course. Never could get anybody to tell me where the spots are. Boy, I'm going to find my own someday, and I'm not going to tell anybody where they are. But anyhow, Bill, my youngest son, looked at it. He says, "Oh, is that what you're looking for? Is that what the..." Oh, well, just a minute. Took a shopping bag, was gone about 10 minutes, came back with half a shopping bag full of white morels. I go, "Where the devil did you get those?" He said, "Down in the vacant lot there on the corner of 3rd and Maple." So that was my first introduction to the Dewey lot. I went down and looked around the foundations of the old house that were there. You can still see the foundations. Sure enough, white morel mushrooms all over the place, and I'd been knocking myself out for 4 years out in the woods trying to find them, Then I really looked around and I discovered a whole bunch of plants that were still growing wild in what had been Professor Dewey's garden. Needless to say, several of them ended up down the alley in my garden. Well, nobody was looking after them, but Dewey had been quite a botanist in his day, and he'd imported a lot of plants. Every place he could find them, seeds, things like that people would give him, and he had some really weird plants that nobody else had seen growing in Michigan in the backyard of that house that once sat on 3rd and Maple Street. And now they're sitting in the backyard of the house on 4th Street, right behind it, some of them. I expect I must go back and see what's happened to them. I can maybe replant them again. Professor Dewey discovered when he was teaching at the school, that wooden school that we saw on the slide, the old Alpena Union School, built in 1868. He took over in 1871, discovered that, quite a few things about school he discovered. But one of them was that they didn't have any textbooks to go with, The school board bought a bunch of trees and handed them to Professor Dewey and said, "Here, plant them." wherever you think they need to be planted. And so Professor Dewey, who had a math class going, a geometry class going in the 3rd floor, looked out of the 3rd floor window at the bare school ground and said, well, we might as well make them do double duty. And so he planted these trees, and some of them are still there, not too many, but a couple. There were elm, basswood, can't remember another kind too, oak I think, but of those, the elm, there's a couple of elms still there, and one basswood I think on that block. And he planted the trees in such a shape that the kids in that room could look down and do geometry problems using these trees, you know. The school was really sort of, it's Thunder Bay today, you know, that block. It was really far away from town when they first built it. There were 2 or 3 blocks of fair wilderness before you got down to the village around the river, you know. Of course, it grew very, very quickly. The town did, back to the school. Dewey was the one who also discovered that there was no science book, and so he wrote a small book about it, and it's a book that has become quite famous, at least with those of us who have done any research in Alpine history. I know Cal Loomis has quoted from it many times. A little pamphlet, which I'd like to find more of, Alpena County, its shore lines and terraces, its rocks and hills, its giant wells and subterranean rivers, its resources and curiosities. End of title. There are only 3 or 4 of these books in existence, as far as I know. Fortunately, it's been reprinted in the Alpena News, and we have a copy of that reprint. Dewey apparently spent a great deal of his time, those first years, tramping through the woods. It was he who discovered the sinkholes fell into a pattern. It was he who theorized that the waters from the underground rivers, which he was sure were here, came out in Misery Bay, the hole in the bay that I showed some of you, that more of you are familiar with, I'm sure. Things he couldn't possibly have known, but divined from his just plain knowledge of geology and of looking around through the area. Not only did Dewey arrange the trees on the courthouse lawn, or the schoolhouse lawn, in such a way that the geometry students could use them, but he innovated a few other things, like one day he was out walking, we are told. I think Ella White does this in her book. He was out walking with Mr. George Richardson, one of the prominent lumber barons in town, near Richardson Mill, Ford Garage today. Bob Scott's office building is the original Richardson Mill office building too. And Dewey came across this huge conglomerate rock. It was filled with red and black jasper stones, fine pebbles of chalcedony put together with massive quartz. It was a pudding stone, as we know it today. And he suggested that would make a fine decorative piece for the schoolhouse grounds. So the next day it was delivered to the schoolhouse lawn, thanks to Mr. George Richardson. It served as base for the girls playing tag for the next quite a few years. He wrote the book so that his kids could, in science class, Earth Science, could have something to go with, and it's a book that's absolutely invaluable to us now. Dewey should have written many books. He had a way with words that, well, I suppose for its day it was right in line. A little flowery, mayhaps, but nevertheless nice. I like the way he writes. For instance, at the end of his book, he suggests this: the long high hill and tableland west of Ossining. At which point I asked the children, and where would that be? Nicholson Hill, of course. Was only a great furrow pushed up by that tongue of ice that crept out of the north down through Lake Huron's bed toward the close of the glacial epoch. Imagine one of the early progenitors of the human race standing on top of that huge fresh furrow, dressed in skins, stone weapons strung at his side, gazing out on that scene of cold desolation. Nicholson Hill, can you imagine? Caveman in skins standing there. Dewey sees this. Could be. A herd of mammoths, that enormous elephant that roamed the forests of Michigan in that early day, may have been close by, cropping the tender herbage of the dawning springtime. Sheer poetry. What a beautiful contrast is presented as you stand on that same spot today, and this is 1891 he was writing this, and gaze out over the same region, now changed to liquid blue. Before you in full view is spread out the entire magnificent harbor of Thunder Bay. And he goes on and on. But the whole book is a delight to read, as I say, almost sheer poetry. And of course I like to get my kids all excited about, do you suppose there was an early man with stone weapons only, with animal skins for clothes, standing close by a herd of mammoths on Nicholson Hill, looking across Thunder Bay? Could be, because there's so much mystery involved in the prehistoric copper culture, the Hopewell people, the mound builders, so much history that we don't know. Perhaps we will. We're digging it up pretty fast. Professor Dewey, though, had a great sense of humor. I guess it was the duty of the professor, the superintendent, to report through the newspaper, so the whole public could read, the goings-on of the school in a report to the Board of Education, which Dewey did with great regularity, and I love it. To the Board of Education, gentlemen, I have the honor to lay before you here my 19th quarterly report of the schools under your control, embracing a part of the school year from September 1877 to April 1878. The number of pupils received into school, and I didn't count any named twice, was 598. The average number belonging has been 425, of whom 391 were present each day, by and large. The number of cases of tardiness has been unusually large, being 1,527, or about 50 to 60%, more than for any corresponding period in the last 6 years. Of each 100 who came to school, 1 4/10 were behind time. From all appearances, the fault lies pretty nearly equally between parents, pupils, and marbles. Now, there isn't much to be done about the first two, but the last cause could be removed to considerable extent. A great many pupils who come to school late start from home in season, but are suffered to stop on the sidewalks and violate the provisions of City Ordinance 1 bearing on this subject. In doing this, they too frequently offend passers-by. Indeed, I do not know of any greater nuisance to parents, to children, to pedestrians, to language, and to dry goods than marbles. And it is my opinion that the Common Council would do one good thing by forbidding the game on the sidewalks of our city. And then he goes on, forgive me, the cold persists. The number of visits from members of the Board of Education to our schools this quarter was 27, 7 of those being to Miss Selleck's room. 2 of our teachers, however, Susie Dixon and Miss Harper, inform me they haven't seen hide nor hair of a school board member since school began last fall. I get a mental picture of what Miss Dixon and Miss Harper look like, don't you? There are a few things to which I would like to call your attention. Our scholars have no water to drink in their schools, except, of course, the water that most of the inhabitants of Alpena drink all the time, from the shallow wells. But this water is not fit for human consumption, and the fact that it is used by a large proportion of our citizens doesn't make it any purer. It is literally filled during the warm weather with swarms of living creatures, so that the children every day unconsciously devour thousands of living animals, some of which, you may be surprised to learn, do not die, but continue to thrive within their human domain and sometimes cause serious physical derangement. This could be pretty much entirely remedied in our schools by obtaining good filters. I would call attention to the fact that the schoolyard in Campbellville, would that be Churchill School? I expect so. The old Garfield School, Churchill School, Alpena County Normal, now a vacant lot close to what was called the Four Corner gas station, right? Anyway, the schoolyard in Campbellville is filled with rubbish and stumps, and they could be removed at small cost and little effort to the school board. It's a great pity that the neat woodshed has not been built at the rear of the Campbellville School instead of the unsightly shack we've got leaning against the front door. It would be a good idea if the school board would purchase a microscope, so that at least the students of Alpena would grow up knowing how much foreign material they were consuming in every drop of local river water they drink. Oh, dear, 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 dear. And he does go on and on to the school board. I think we ought to have that today. I think that's a good thing right there. Published report from the superintendent of schools. Well, maybe not. Maybe not. Anyway, Professor Dewey went on then to resign as superintendent of schools and later became an inventor of sorts. He invented the famous Dewey snowplow, patented yet, and it actually went into production. It was a wooden rig that, there were pictures of it in the paper of the time. This was in the 1890s, and it mounted on a sled of sorts, and it was remarkable in that you could raise and lower this A-shaped hunk, that was actually doing the plowing. Also, it collapsed, so that if you should happen to run into a load of logs coming from the other way, you could collapse the wings of the plow, and it would be no wider than an ordinary sled, you know. He invented that. He also went into the road paving business using a very new concept of paving crushed stone, gravel, if you please. Let's see, I brought along a whole bunch of garbage here, but not going to get at all of it. Uncle Billy Cullings, Whistling Billy, we should do a whole chapter on him. And a couple of things just to end up with here. Came across this paper. When you find something in the microfilm downtown of the old newspapers, for 10 cents you can take a picture of what you find, which is a neat thing, and this panics me. W.H. Davison, I have no idea. I think this paper was 1900. We sell the largest and best black and white striped shirts for 50 cents, and they got union-made pants at Davisons for 50 cents a leg. How you like that? Good black overalls and jackets, 50 cents. Oh, boy. $8.50 buys you the best gray mixed men's suit in single and double-breasted that we have ever shown. $8.50. Probably got 2 pair of pants, you know. The prices were unbelievable. The police department also had to publish in the local paper a report of what they had accomplished over a certain period. Monthly report. One I came across for 1896 in the old newspapers. During this past month, the report reads, the police have received 48 business calls, 70 visitors calls, received 78 phone calls, phones were still pretty new, and sent 30. Found 10 electric lights not lighted, 1 sudden death has been reported, have caught 4 runaway horses, responded to 1 fire alarm and rendered assistance, responded to 2 false alarms, 2 serious accidents were reported, returned 2 lost children to their parents, picked up and returned to their homes 5 adults, also returned 1 stray horse to its barn. Found 4 doors open and notified owners, reported 7 dangerous sidewalks, 3 defective sewers, and 2 bursted water pipes. Attended 21 boats, 146 trains, and moved 128 people who were loafing on the bridge. Visited 30 saloons, 2 persons were reported to the poor board, received 2 complaints, made 11 arrests, attended 2 funerals, rendered assistance to 336 men and 169 women, dispersed 45 disorderly crowds, received 6 letters, answered 2, attended police court twice, justice court 4 times, stopped boys playing football 12 times, ordered 69 horses tied, served 4 warrants, and moved 28 loafers out of stairways, and on and on and on it goes. We put 4 boys out of the pool rooms. There were 325 boys sent home after the curfew hour of 9 o'clock. End of report. Well, the story of Alpena and the people who lived in it and made it can go on endlessly. A chapter about Dr. McTavish we should definitely do. The first fire chief of Alpena. We stand corrected. There should be chapters on Whistling Billy, who was an early trapper who came here but left in the 1890s. Well, he came in and out, but left in the 1890s when it was just getting too crowded for him. All these white folks come up here. Indians never steal nothing. Can't leave my stuff in my boat anymore, Uncle Bill reported, because white folks will steal you blind, not the Indians, who were his friends. Mary Carter, Sarah Carter, Injun Jim Herman reminded me of that. So many stories that should be, shall we say, written. We could go on and on endlessly. I asked Bob if we could offer our services to people who might need them, and we have done a lot of speaking around, Bob, more than I perhaps lately. He said sure, as long as it doesn't get out of hand, which means that we would be happy to do what we can do in one area or another. If any of you know of groups who are interested in the history, of course, in so doing, we're looking for information too, because so help me, I'm going to put it down sometime. Several chapters put together now. You all promise you'll buy it if I do get it done. Okay, it's been fun. I'm so glad you've all come.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Where does Fremont come in?
The town was first named Fremont. The town was first named Fremont by those first 4 proprietors who came here. The land was purchased at the mouth of the river by 4 partners. George Fletcher had half of it. He put up half the money. The other half was put up by Lockwood, who sold then half of his half to Oldfield and Minor Canadians. The four of them came here in the fall. They bought the land in 55. They came here in the fall of 56 for the first time together. They had had Dan Carter up here, their timber cruiser, checking it out, starting to prepare the river for running of logs down close to the mouth of the river here. They came in the fall of 1856, October, and came over from Thunder Bay Island. It was getting late in the season. Soon the lakes would freeze, and they'd have to rush back. But they spent one night here, and that's quite a famous story. They were feeling no pain, and they set about to raise a flag over the town and name the town, but nobody had a flag of the United States. All they had, or even Michigan, all they had was a flag for the Fremont for President campaign. Fremont was a Republican candidate. He didn't win. Buchanan won. And in 1856 presidential election. So they flew the flag over the town. We always got to raise a flag, claim it, And so they called the town Fremont. Fletcher was a great Republican, and so they thought that was an appropriate name, and they called the town Fremont. They also set about that night to lay out the first street, but they were in no condition to do it. They laid out River Street, and it's crooked to this day because they kept running into the river, but I've told that story before. Fremont. It then changed names in 1858 when it was discovered there were two Fremonts in Michigan, and the mail kept getting mixed up after we got a post office. So they changed it first to Thunder Bay for a minute, and then to Alpena, which was by this time the name of the county. You all read the Free Press this morning?
What about Anamaki?
Anamaki is the Indian word for thunder. It belonged to a former chief of this area, way back when.
What was named that then?
The county was named Anamaki.
Was it county?
Yeah, and in the Free Press today, they shot down another one of my best stories. Oh well, I still hold with it. The county was named Anamaki at first by the legislature. See, they surveyed this area. Michigan became a state 1837. They surveyed up here. The government surveyors finally gridded us out into geographic townships in 1839 and 40, at which time then the state legislature took the whole top of the half of the hand of Michigan, 29 counties across the top, of which we're one, and gave them all names. They were just places on a map. There wasn't anybody living here then, just a few trappers in and out. Sheboygan was settled, that had began to be started by then. And they gave us the name Anamaki. And they gave, as the Free Press explained this morning in the Detroit area section, they gave the names of former Indian chiefs to several of the counties. And Anamaki was, I guess, a chief in this area, though I know nothing about him. The chiefs who signed the original treaties of 1819, again 1836, that gave all of Michigan to the white man. Then later it was changed. Before there was anybody here, it was changed in 1844 for some unknown reason. I think it was 44. For some unknown reason, our county was changed from Anamaki, which was the name of the river here. That's Thunder River, Anamaki River, to Alpena. And the Free Press today says Henry Schoolcraft just picked names and changed it, to Alpena. Just made it up. But I don't know. I'd sure like to talk to Jerry Haltiner about that. What does the name Alpena mean? You get a lot of versions of it. Some people say it stems from the Arabic. I don't know. I had always heard the story that a legislator in Lansing, a young man, had been up here in this neck of the woods hunting with his father after the county was named Anamaki. And they must have landed on Partridge Point or someplace and had been hunting. He came back to the legislature, and so we got to change the name of that county. That place is loaded with partridge, and the Indian name for partridge is Alpena or something close to that. That's the story I had always heard, the one I always tell. Don't know, because the Alpena, that's where I get my pet story.
My great-grandfather always told me that the name of the town that they used at that time was Alpine, because it was all pine here.
Well, I've never heard that version before.
And it finally narrowed down
to Alpena. Yeah, I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
Never heard that before.
Well, that was going around for a long time.
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe we'll never know for sure. But I'd like very much, Bob Haltiner, is he not here? Probably. There's an old Indian book, an old book that Jerry Haltiner has, a leather-bound volume in which are a lot of the words transcribed from the original Indian language here, which is not a pure Chippewa, but a Duke's mixture, which leads us to yet another story, which I have no intention of telling now. Fear not. Possibly we could come up with what the word Alpena or Alpena does come close to in the Chippewa dialect that was used here. I just don't know, but I don't believe that guy in the Free Press. Well, what difference? That's the exciting part, the changes, the speculation. But Fremont, that we know. That we know. Do you know what Fremont, Michigan is now?
Yeah.
You know where it is? What's it famous for?
Baby food.
Gerber baby food, right.
Yeah.
Gerber baby food. Big Gerber baby on the water tower. They were here first, so they got to keep the name. Besides, Fremont didn't make it, and who cares about the guy that didn't make it,
Huh.
So it doesn't matter too much.
And
Yeah.
have you ever heard of Osneek, met twin stone?
The Twin Stones, sure. Go by what? All right, now just a minute. Shingle.
On each side of the river.
Shingle ba wasani ko ba what? That's Asani. Shingle. Can I do that twice? Shingle ba wasani ko ba what? Yeah. And they took Wasanik out of the center, which means divine images of divine gods, and leave more than one gift, please. Right? Yeah. There were two big rocks in the harbor there, the mouth of the river, right there by Osneek Park. Two big stones that that was a powwow ground for the Indians. There's quite a group of villages down there too, but that was where they went on one of their many ceremonies. They traveled a lot, those Indians in this area, and they would go down to Osneek and Devil River, and have this certain ceremony, part of their culture, their religion, and they worshiped those two rocks that were out there in the water. Images of the divine chiefs, those were, and they were to leave their gifts. And when Isaac Wilson first came up in this area, right before Birch and Eldridge came to start the mill down there, he reported that those two rocks were there. When he first saw them, they were loaded with all kinds of goodies that the Indians had left, according to Oliver's book. They left sacrifices, Boy, there'd be some good digging there, wouldn't there? Of course, naturally, the white man came along and pulled the rocks out and used them for gill net anchors. We've treated everything and everybody so shabbily, it makes me ashamed to be a white person. Honestly, well, of course, they were going to start a mill there. They had to get rid of those rocks. They couldn't have them right there. But they could have moved them and saved them, because that's a big piece of Indian history from this area. Well, there's so much of that Indian history that we don't know. That's fascinating, that we'll never know probably. I guess we will. I guess we're coming to it. The legend of the Sauk Massacre of this area. At least that guy in the Free Press this morning did acknowledge the fact that there were once Sauk Indians living in this area. Most historians do not. And I'm a firm believer in the Sauk Massacre story, that once Saginaw Valley was all Sauk. Saganine, they were called, or Sauk.
Well, there must have been a lot of Indians here, because when I was a child, growing up, where the college is now, the first college, we used to dig in the sand there and find Indian there.
Sure. That's where Hall Teenard made most of his important finds, the copper cache and the Iroquois bowl.
By the river there.
Sure. And Mishikiwas lived right across the river from there. So the chief here lived right up on the high point across the river. Turn it the big boy. It kind of goes up to a hill there.
Yeah,
a couple of tourist cabins there. Yeah. That's where Mishikiwas' main camp was. And there were camps all along the other side of the river too. Of course they moved a lot when it got dirty. They just moved. But there's an awful lot, 10,000 years of Indian history we don't really think about, as Haltina probably told you in his first lecture. But we're finding it out.
Indians were right on the
Yes,
border.
but there were not as many Indians living in this area, the Saginaw Valley, as one would expect to find living in a valley like this that had so much hunting ground and all,
Yeah.
So something traumatic had happened during the years to lower the Indian population. And the story of the Sauk Massacre probably takes care of that, where all the other tribes got together and came down and annihilated all of the Sauk in the Saginaw Valley, the remnants of whom then were suspected of having the spirits were living in the forest. And so the Indians had planned, and these were the Iroquois too, the Six Nations of New York, and the Potawatomi, all of the Algonquins, the Potawatomi, Menominee, Chippewa, of course, who were living around this area, had planned to split the Saginaw Forest to use as a common hunting ground. according to this legend, which I got from Alpena. So I believe it, 'cause I believe everything he ever told me.
That's what you put in the paper today.
Huh?
That's what you had in the paper
Yeah,
today.
more or less. But that all of the Sauk were massacred, except then they suspected that the spirits of the Sauk were lurking in the woods, and they wouldn't send their hunting parties in. So it became the haunted valley, and no Indian would go near it. Now, we don't know when this happened. I think around between 1200 and 1400. I'm not sure. Nobody's sure. Darned Indians, they never wrote anything down. They just said many moons ago, and what does that mean,
Yeah.
And then they never told anything in the right order, so you don't know which came first. But if that is true, and I believe it to be true, then the Saginaw Valley was the haunted valley, and it later became a sort of a penal colony for all of these tribes, and they would send the Indians there, so the legend goes, who were the bad guys, right? I don't mean to say that all Indians in this area were murderers and cutthroats, but if you had a political difference with a chief, for some reason or other you were exiled from your tribe, you were sent here. It would explain so many things. The mystery fort at Morris Bay that we don't know anything about, and fort that Jerry found out in the woods that never found any artifacts, any arrowheads or hammers. It was a fort, all right, but nobody ever got killed there. No war took place there. Was it hastily built by the Saguenay, to whom we feel the Hubbard Lake tribe probably were related, if not were pure Saguenay, northern villages who were not annihilated because they didn't know they were here, that they ran up and built this fort real quick, feeling that the attackers were coming, but then never did. They never did get here. It would explain why Saganaw claimed to be Ottawa, and Chief Mishikiwas, Oliver says, spoke a weird dialect of Chippewa, not the pure Chippewa that Oliver was used to in Wisconsin and other places where the Chippewa were found, but a dialect that grew up from the influence of several tribes that were in their background. A Duke's mixture, in other words, of Indians, not pure Chippewa, inhabited Alpena. And it would explain why there were not as many Indians in the area as one would expect to find, because of the cushy hunting. They just had to throw a fish line out the back door and an arrow out the front door, for all the food they wanted. No problem living here. So much of it we don't know, and that's the exciting part. And of course, I think the most exciting part of all of Indian history, and something we really don't know anything about, are the mound builders, the prehistoric copper people. Who were they? Listen, there's a lot to that we don't know yet that is coming to the fore. Now, we're going to have to write the history books all over again. You know how we were taught Columbus discovered America? And then, terrible thing, turned out that Leif Erikson got here first. Well, hey, you can just now knock that thing in the cocktat too, because now we're becoming awfully close to perhaps being able to prove very soon now that there were Europeans up here a lot earlier than we ever gave them credit for, that they were the mound builders, they were the prehistoric copper miners possibly, that they were Egyptian, Phoenicians, Celtics from Spain. Awful lot we're finding out that really would have freaked people out 20 years ago if you'd have suggested it. So, it's an ever-changing thing, and I think really exciting. History is no means dead. By no means. By no means.
No history of how the Indians got here.
No, we don't. Except the Indian that we found here, the white man found here, knew nothing of how the prehistoric copper miners mined. They didn't use those mines. They used a few pieces of copper they found laying around, but they didn't mine. They didn't know anything about the people who did mine. Isle Royale, Keweenaw Peninsula, Don't know who they were. Don't know who they were. And they left their tools laying around as if they'd gone to lunch and were expecting to come back.
Yeah.
And they left them for thousands of years. What happened? Where'd they go to? The mounds. Do you know the mounds of St. Louis? The whole city of St. Louis is the Okahokia Mound. Mound builders, these are. People that were up to 8 feet tall who, it's wild. It really is. Some of them, and we have mounds in Alpena County. Mound builder mounds, not Indian mounds. There is a difference. Mounds that rival, not in Alpena County, but down in southern Michigan and in Ohio, and points to the south, mounds that rival the mounds of Tikal in Guatemala, mounds of that kind, worship, burial mounds, but also religious mounds, built entirely of dirt. Yeah, an incredible amount of history that if we can beat the shopping centers and the superhighways to the areas, before they ruin all of the history that lays down there that we could dig up. In the meantime, I'm going to get Haltiner off his rear, Bob that is, to dig up a burial site that's right around the campus of community college pretty soon. Now there's a war site over there that might tell us quite a bit of story too. Jerry Haltiner found it long ago. There are at least three people in it, and probably a lot more. He covered it up right away and didn't go after it. But it's a war grave of some kind, you know. A lot of it right under our feet. Isn't that exciting? I can hardly wait for spring to come so we can get out some more. Hey, thank you for coming.
You were listening to Ann Tabor talk about the history of Alpena, recorded February 26, 1978.